We didn't discover Noah's Ark. We stumbled across something much worse. Is Noah's Ark a fairy tale or an actually historical relic that can be found today? It's interesting that we've discovered there's multiple flood myths throughout history. What if I told you the story of a massive flood that wiped out most of humanity isn't just found in the Bible? In fact, ancient flood myths show up all over the world, in cultures separated by oceans, languages, and millennia. It's almost as if they were all remembering the same event, just told through different cultural lenses. This has led some to even speculate that the Bible's account of Noah's Ark was actually copied from other ancient myths. And if the flood account is universally agreed upon, is there any evidence for Noah's Ark today? And the dark history of the exploration, where some people believe that this site is today, may shock you. But more on that later. The Mesopotamian Epic of Gilgamesh tells of a man who was warned by the gods to build a boat to save himself, his family, and even animals from a worldwide flood. In ancient Egypt, the coffin text described the god Atum sending a flood to destroy mankind, followed by a promise to never bring such destruction again. Now, it's not as detailed as the Genesis account, but it reveals a divine judge. The Hindu tradition has a tale of a man named Manu, warned by a fish, the god of Vishnu, to build a boat before a great flood comes. Even in China, there's ancient legends spoken of a catastrophic flood, controlled by the hero Yu the Great. Even the Greeks have a story of a flood sent by Zeus. The Aztecs and Native American tribes carry tales of massive floods, often with divine judgment, a chosen survivor, and a mission to rebuild. All of this points to something profound. Across time and continents, cultures that had no contact with each other share strikingly similar flood stories. Now, all of a sudden, the flood story that some people dismiss as a fairy tale when read in Genesis doesn't sound so mythological. But maybe Noah's Ark is actually historically more accurate to an ancient Jewish oral tradition. But before we get into that, guys, my name is Ruslan. This channel exists to encourage, empower, and inspire you to live a life that blesses God. Sometimes that looks like us looking at different speculative stories that claim to have evidence of archaeology and trying to give a biblical take that ties it into scripture. So if you're new here, or if you're not new here, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button. There's a huge percentage of the people that watch this channel, unfortunately, are not subscribed. Let's jump into the video. So when it comes to speculation about Noah's Ark, there's three primary sites. The first is called the Ararat anomaly. The second, and the most widely known, is the Drupader site. And the third is called the Nami, discovered by Chinese researchers. All of them have their controversies, and we're going to get into that. But before we get into all the different sites, there's actually some finds around the mountain itself that are very intriguing. So these finds are all throughout the Mount Ararat region. These are called Droge stones. You see them revealed with little holes in the bottom, and there's been crosses etched into all of them that obviously came later. This is the largest Droge stone found in the region. It is approximately 11 feet tall, 4 feet of it going underground. There's those crosses I told you about. And basically the purpose of these were they were connected to the boat, and as the water levels rose, they would drop off these Droge stones. And so these were allegedly tied to the ark and used as stabilizers to keep the boat from tipping over because it was so massive, specifically in massive storms. But Droge stones aren't a new discovery. They've been found all around the region, from the Mount Ararat region to the Mediterranean Sea. This is one actually discovered in Israel. But what's interesting is the Droge stones found around Mount Ararat are the largest ones that have ever been found. You can see the contrast between this one that was found near Israel and the one that we looked at previously, which are way, way bigger. Okay, so a while back, National Geographic created a simulation of Noah's Ark, meaning that they created an at-scale model and put it in rough terrain of simulated water. And they show that when you are experimenting the type of unpredictable water and rough terrain that Noah's Ark was experiencing, that it would likely flip over. As you see the waves increase with intensity, you see the boat slowly shift and eventually it topples over. But they later go on to make a model based on these Droge stones that were discovered all over the Mount Ararat region, and they then redo the test with an at-scale version of these Droge stones. And as you can see, after they attach these Droge stones to this model of the boat, it is now able to sustain more of the ocean current without toppling over. Now, these Droge stones are littered all throughout the region, but they're not the only things that tell the story of Noah's Ark in the Mount Ararat region. Now, the interesting thing about this region is that it actually was the historical site for the world's oldest Christian nation. You see, Eastern Turkey was historically Armenia, and Armenia is the world's oldest nation, as we'll get into a bit later. This was oddly enough explored in the TV show Manifest, which describes the landing site of Noah's Ark on Mount Ararat, but calls Mount Ararat Armenia, which is extremely controversial because Mount Ararat today is in eastern Turkey. But the people of Armenia have a deep connection to Mount Ararat. So I decided to reach out to my buddy Arthur from the Apologia Center, who grew up near Mount Ararat, to get his perspective on this. If we look at archaeology, there's some people that claim that this map with Mount Ararat and Noah's Ark site being in Armenia, modern day Turkey, wasn't discovered or found in the historical record until the 1800s.
Yeah, that seems to be a little bit incorrect. So I'll read a Bible passage, Genesis 8:4. And the ark rested in the 7th month on the 7th day of the month upon the mountains of Ararat. And Ararat is essentially the Urartu region, which Urartu has been a reference to Armenians since the beginning, the kingdom of Urartu. And all of our history goes back to that, all the kings and all that stuff. There's a Babylonian map that speaks about the world. It's called the Imago Mundi. And the Babylonian map has Urartu as the place of the ark. So both biblically and you can say extra biblically, we have references to Noah's Ark landing on the mountains of Ararat.
And what year, how old is that map that you're referencing, the Babylonian
It's about
map?
3,000 years old. You know, it's interesting that when Noah gets off the ark, it says that he planted a vineyard and then made wine, and then he gets drunk from this wine. That region, the plains of Ararat that come into Armenia, is extremely lush and is perfect for vineyards. As a matter of fact, one of the oldest wineries in the world that's ever been found has been found in that region, and the region is called Armenia. And I just think it's very interesting that the oldest winery is in the region of Mount Ararat, the plains of Mount Ararat, and then we get Noah making wine and getting drunk off the wine. So a part of me sort of thinks he ended up in the region of Armenia.
So Arthur, you were actually close to this mountain, and there's a lot of significance to this mountain. This isn't just like a YouTube video or a historical location that's interesting to talk about. So share a little bit about your experience in growing up and seeing this mountain.
It's looming, you know, it's like always present. You cannot escape it. I have a friend that we went to Armenia with in 2018, and he's not Armenian, and he stopped at one moment. We were kind of on the outskirts of the mountain in the Armenia side, called the Ararat Plains, and he said, "Arthur, this is where God restarted the world." And I was like, man, I haven't even thought about that. But yeah, it's always present. Every time you look out your window, the mountain is essentially there. Maybe some winter days, you know, like it gets covered up. And I think it's kind of seared into the psyche of every Armenian individual, like looking outside of window or looking outside and seeing the mountain. I call it the Great Mountain, right? Or it's regularly called the Mountain of Noah. And then so when you walk into every Armenian person's home, you're probably going to see some kind of a painting of Mount Ararat just there. And I feel like Armenians do this subconsciously. As though the painting is a window in Armenia looking towards the mountain. I mean, there's such a special feeling when you are in Armenia and you look towards the mountain and realizing that civilization restarted in that part of the world.
So it's clear that there's a lot of historical accounts and tradition tied to the Ark being in this region. So let's look at the three different claims of where people think that the Ark landed. So the first and probably the least exciting is this Ararat anomaly. So this was discovered when a pilot flew over the region and saw what he believed was a boat-like shape in the mountains. But many researchers have chalked this up as just a geological structure, and there really isn't much evidence pointing to the Ark being here. But the next location is by far the most interesting and controversial. The next location is the Derupiner site, explored by Ron Wyatt, who is not without his own controversies and claims of him having different relics that he says God told him not to reveal, like blood from the crucifixion site of Jesus, and the true location of the Ark of the Covenant. So I'm going to take this with a big grain of salt. But ironically enough, he actually seems to be the biggest researcher on this site, along with his colleague David Fazel. Now, all of these spots are not without controversy, but just suspend belief with me for a second. Now, when they first found this site, it's pretty phenomenal. It measures similarly, and maybe it is a petrified ship turned into rock and terrain. The only catch is when they measured it with the Hebrew cubit, it didn't match the measurement you see in the scriptures. This is when Ron Wyatt pointed out that the Hebrew cubit actually hadn't been invented yet, and they were using the Egyptian model. So when Ron Wyatt punched in all the numbers using the Egyptian math, it oddly enough fit the size of the Ark. Now, as they did research on this area, they pulled rocks, which some believe to be petrified wood. Now, as they did tests on these, they had some similarities to wood, but many geologists believed that they didn't match. But they didn't stop Ron and his partner David from finding some more interesting patterns in this excavation site. As they used a metal detector, they noticed that the metal detector was actually going off in a very specific pattern. They used rocks to mark each spot that the metal detector went off, and later connected these rocks using tape. As you see here, it connects a grid-like structure similarly to what you would see in some sort of building. Ron and David believe that the metal was actually metal fasteners used to join the entire Ark. And this could be one of the most compelling arguments for this site, the seemingly man-made connection and structure of these different pieces. And years later, Ron Wyatt's partner, David Fuseld, also did a paper with a geologist refuting his earlier claims about the findings. Then there's the site Nami, discovered by the Chinese researchers. A group of evangelical Chinese researchers found a cave which they believed was the inside of Noah's Ark. They even pointed out to certain instances of wood being inside of this cave. As they said, it was clear as day, and they had nothing to hide. This is an astronomical find. The only problem with all three of these sites, specifically the latter two, is the lack of continued excavation, analysis, and peer-reviewed research. In almost every case, geologists have an explanation for what these folks are saying are wood-like ruins. Specifically in the Nami site, they were accused of staging this entire discovery, with some American researchers even backing out when they felt like it was a hoax. But there's one massive problem with continued in-depth research of getting into these sites and figuring out what's exactly going on. And that is what I mentioned earlier, when the Turks took over this part of Armenia. Here's Arthur from the Apologia Center going more in depth to explain the actual darker side of this entire region.
But there's a darker history with this mountain. You are growing up seeing it, but historically, it has a very sad backstory.
Predominantly in 1915, when World War I was happening, is that the Ottoman government was essentially going through a civil war and was taken over by the Young Turks. And the Young Turks essentially aimed at wiping away the Armenian population. And I would just say the Christian population as well, because it wasn't just Armenians. In that region, it was predominantly Armenians, but throughout the Ottoman Empire, Assyrians and Greeks were targeted as well. And so about 80% of the Armenian population from that region, because they were near the mountain, were essentially wiped away. And, they were either killed or taken on death marches. There have been mass graves that have been found, and those mass graves are very far away, as a matter of fact, in modern-day Syria. But they would put people on these marches. They separated the men and the women. Children were taken and converted into Islam. There's a good population in Turkey currently that can trace their ancestry back to Armenians. They're what's referred to as Islamicized Armenians because they were given a brand new Turkish identity. And quite a bit of them essentially ended up in the diaspora. This is partly why you have so many Armenians in Middle Eastern countries.
Yeah, so it sounds like God's hand has been on Armenia. It sounds like it's in the history of the world. It sounds like they really shouldn't still have a country, yet they do, and a massive diaspora. I'm seeing a lot of parallels with what some people would say is Israel being God's people, God having a plan for them, and despite all the odds, they overcome all of these things that they've experienced persecution. And Armenians, in the same way, the Armenian genocide is something that inspired to commit the Holocaust, but it isn't talked about as much. And so as April is Armenian Genocide Commemoration Month, can you give us a little bit of insight in terms of your perspective and how you feel this genocide impacts the global perspective of Armenia and Armenians specifically, and it often being overlooked as this nation that's endured massive persecution, primarily for their faith and ethnic identity?
Yeah, well, again, Armenians became Christians in 301 AD as a state religion, and that's considered the first Christian nation on the planet. And we've suffered through that, right? Like, we've suffered because of that. In the early years, it was the Persians that the Armenians had to defend themselves from. The Persians wanted to reconvert Armenians to ancient paganism, Zoroastrianism, and the Armenians resisted that. Plenty of people died. They lost wars and they resisted that. And throughout the years, people have come and gone. And again, chiefly amongst them has been Islam. Islam has dominated that region of the world. Armenians have been under Islamic domination and rule and come out of it, still maintaining a Christian identity as a national people. And so I would say that it is a message to the world to maintain and kind of lean into your Christian identity. Not just have a Christian identity, but actually practice what Christianity is and what Christianity looks like. And again, the mountain, I feel like the mountain is like for the world, right? It's not like an Armenian thing. I know Armenians have lived there forever. Until we were wiped out and kind of pushed away to the other side of the mountain, which is kind of traumatic. You're always looking at the mountain, but you can't go there really. But again, it's a part of God's promise. It's a part of what God has done for humanity, in that He saved humanity. And the symbol of that is the rainbow. We speak about quite a bit because it's in the Bible. But for us, Armenians, the symbol of that is the mountain. As a matter of fact, on many different Armenian kind of emblems and logos, you will see the mountain, and on top of the mountain, there's a tiny little ark.
Art, just tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do, and where they can find more information.
So I run an organization called Apologia Center, and we have a YouTube channel called Apologia Center. If people want to check it out, we'd love that. Any platform, it's Apologia Center, at Apologia Center. They can email me at info@apologiacenter.com. I do trainings for people in churches in doing apologetics. So reach out to me. I'd love to come by and train you guys.
So is Noah's Ark in the Mount Ararat region? Like, we will never know. And in the making of this video, I actually reached out to my buddy Mike Jones, and I was trying to get his thoughts on this entire situation. And he presented a rather simple claim that it's likely that after they landed and they got out of the ark, the wood from the ark was probably used to build houses for the survivors. That it's highly unlikely that Noah and his family got out of the ark and just left it sitting there for 5,000 years. That they probably repurposed the wood to restart civilization. But the darker nature around this topic regarding historical Armenia now being modern-day Turkey, I think is the real takeaway. Armenian people have been persecuted primarily for their Armenian Christian heritage for thousands of years. And that echoes what we see in Scripture when Jesus said that in this life we will have trouble, that when we follow Him, we can experience persecution, that it's not just going to be all peaches and butterflies and rainbows. And that's the beautiful part about being a follower of Jesus, is even when times are good or when times are bad, our faith isn't anchored on our external circumstances. Our faith is anchored on who Jesus is. That's the beautiful part of growing up Armenian. My people have endured immense persecution throughout the ages, but we've remained resilient and we've remained anchored to our Christian identity. It's kind of like that cliche phrase, no Jesus, no peace. No Jesus,
no peace. That Jesus doesn't just promise us a cushy, comfy life, he actually provides peace in the midst of chaos. And speaking of chaos, if you want to hear the time where the CIA found the spirit realm and used it to try and track down the Ark of the Covenant, check this video out over here. All right, I'll see you over there. Peace.